Well, just to give a smidgen of background, the origins of the museum go back, as you know, to 1918. That's why we're celebrating our centennial this year. And the Laguna Beach Art Association, our progenitor, became more and more like a museum over the years, in the 1920s and 30s, and finally morphed into being a museum and took the name museum in 1972. And I thought I'd just note that between the four of us on the stage here, we have directed the museum for 33 of the 46 years that it's been a museum. So we got 33 years. So I'll ask our guests a few questions to start with. I'm sure you'll have better ones that will occur to you as we go along. So just hold them until the end, and I'll certainly open things up for questions from the audience. So I'll start with Bill Otton. We'll go in chronological order here. Bill was director of Laguna Art Museum from 1981 to 1987. And he was later director of the Art Museum of South Texas in Corpus Christi. He now lives in San Francisco, correct? And serves on the board of the Marin County Museum of Contemporary Art. So, Bill, in 1981, you took over from the late Tom Enman, who was the director who saw this institution through the transition from being an art association to being a museum in 72. So I suppose you remember Tom well. Did he give you any advice? And I wonder how much you saw yourself continuing what he'd done and how much doing something different.
Well, I want to start with us today, right now. And in 1982, we all learned today, if you watch the television or listen to the radio, that there was quite a bit going on in young people's lives at that time. In 1982, I was director of the Art Museum about the same time that Kavanaugh was doing his thing, and it was a very different environment out here. But back to your question. Just things were changing very fast is really what I was trying to get to, is that the world was changing very fast in the 80s. Tom had me come up to the office in late 1980 after I had been interviewed for the position by Marla Bird and other members of the search committee. And he said, I asked him, well, what can I expect when I start here in the next couple of months? And he said, well, and he was a very personable guy. He was a very nice guy. And he said, well, and he was careful with his answer. He said, you're going to have an interesting time here because you're going to have the local artists who are very interested in the museum. And we need to remember that when I got here, it was a membership organization that was mainly voted on by artists at the annual meeting, which is a different kind of museum than it ended up becoming. And you're going to have those people who love traditional art and really are interested in furthering the cause for the early people that were here. And then you're going to have the contemporary group. And the contemporary art scene in Southern California at that time was really exploding. And so his main advice is get the finances straightened out, because we had some pretty serious financial challenges at that time. And try to get in balance the groups that have very specific interests in the organization and see if you can bring it all together.
Well, I can't leave you initially without mentioning the building, because you were the director when this building became what it is today. And that, I must say, one of the attractions for me in taking this position was what great bones this building has, what great variety of shapes and sizes the galleries have. So it was a major building expansion that you oversaw in 1985 to 6 that added most of the California Gallery next door here, for example, and the whole exterior of the building filling out the site here on Cliff Drive. So what was the impetus behind that, making such a big transformation to the museum like that?
Well, a couple of things. One was external and one was internal. The external part was the Contemporary Art Museum was just going great guns in the temporary contemporary with the Frank Gehry building. LA County was expanding. The Bowers Museum was announcing that they were going to have a huge expansion, and Newport Harbor was talking about doing something. And it's like, wait a minute, if you're going to be a grown-up, I guess you have to do that. So I started picking up on the energy that was happening in the art world in Southern California at that time, and started to talk to the board about the possibility maybe we could do something here. The expansion of this museum, I never considered we would move away from here, but I did consider how are we going to add galleries and public spaces and maybe a vault to house the collection. I must admit that the public side became the side I was most interested in, and we would take care of storing the art somewhere, because if you, I don't know where the art's stored now, but is it in this building?
Some of it's at an off-site
in the old
location.
Vault. Well, it does not have the best vault for an art museum. That's all I can say. And so when we decided to expand, there'll probably be some questions that'll come up later, but why does the building look like it does? Part of it had to do with, guess what, we're in a democracy and the city gets to have some impact as to what the building's going to look like. The architects have it, and of course the board has some, the staff and the board has some input as to what it's going to look like. It was, if you've ever done anything in Laguna Beach on a building expansion or remodeling, guess what? It was probably one of my more successful things I did at the museum, because I did do some things that weren't so good. So we'll get into that later.
So it was at that moment that the museum's name changed, right? From the Laguna Beach Museum of Art to the Laguna Art Museum. Now, why the change?
The fundamental thing was that the museum was in the process of transferring itself into being a museum of its era, of the current era. That didn't mean it was going to cast off its history. It just meant that it was going to be of the present time. The word art in the Laguna Art Museum is a lot more powerful, the word art, than it was in the Laguna Beach Museum of Art. That was more of like a tagline at the end. You could argue it the other way. You could easily argue it the other way. And to get rid of the name beach out of the museum, you could argue that. But it just became an idea that we all decided, let's go for it and really push the word Laguna, which we kept the place, art, which we emphasized, and museum.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Bill. Let me introduce Charles Desmarais a little bit now. Before Laguna, Charles was the director of the California Museum of Photography at UC Riverside. He was director here in Laguna from 1988 to 94, and he went on to be director of the Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati, deputy director of the Brooklyn Museum, president of the San Francisco Art Institute, and currently he's the art critic for the San Francisco Chronicle. So Charles, you were here in the later 80s and early 90s, and you presented shows that must have been much loved by everyone, but you mixed it up with some that I would guess might be a little bit more controversial, like the museum's first major venture into popular culture, which was the Custom Culture show with a K for custom and K for culture as well. Was there a certain amount of pushback in the community about that?
There certainly was pushback. First of all, thanks everybody for having me here, and I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to see some old friends and thrilled to see how beautiful the museum looks. I mean, You've really got it looking fabulous, Malcolm, so
Thank you.
congratulations. As Bill was saying, that transition to start to look at contemporary art was something that started before I got here. I had some great people that worked with me, including two people that are here right now, Bolton and Susan Anderson, who helped think this through. And in fact, Bolton was really internally the original driver for the Custom Culture Show. But we saw the history of art in California as a continuum. And it was one of the stresses, really, that Bill alluded to, was this, you know, 1 foot in the Historical Collections Council and 1 foot in was it the Contemporary Collections Council, I guess? It was something, it was, and there was this kind of real friction between the two among the collectors. I don't know that the community shared the same intensity of feeling, but we worked our best to try to demonstrate that art is a continuum, and it's something that I've believed all my life. When I write about art now, I don't only write about contemporary exhibitions, I write about historical shows, I write about Asian art, I mean, it's all of a piece to me.
So photography was your thing coming here, of course, and you did some great photography shows here, notably Proof, it was called, the Los Angeles Art and the Photograph. And I think I'm right in saying that photography had relatively seldom been presented at Laguna Art Museum before. Did you feel that it's just such an important art form that it should be represented, or is there something special about photography in Laguna Beach?
Well, there certainly is a great history in Laguna Beach with Outerbridge, Paul Outerbridge, and William Mortensen. Thank you so much. Yeah. Those two in particular, but a lot of other artists too.
And George Harrell. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, I've got a whole bunch of people to help me with this. This is really good. So right, exactly. And I didn't really want to be Mr. Photo. I mean, the reason why I sought out this job, in fact, was in order to leave the track that I was in of just being only about the history of photography. But I did bring some knowledge to it. Now, they did an Outerbridge show before I got here. Elaine Dines was regularly curating shows, really. I think 2 or 3 she had done. And it was an expertise that I brought, and I had some contacts. So yes, I did integrate that into this program, but it was, again, just as I saw the historical, you know, the time period as being fungible, I feel that way about the media too.
So now you're the art critic of the San Francisco Chronicle, although you never write about us, of course.
No, I don't.
But neither does the LA Times. And in fact, I really want to ask you about that. We think we do these great things, but the LA Times hardly ever notices. Did you have much success in getting the critic of the LA Times to pay attention to what you were doing here?
Well, 2 things. One, we did because, I mean, so the major shows that we did, I think they paid attention to, certainly. And I think that's true in Bill's time, too. Oh, sorry. The major shows that we did get the attention of the Los Angeles critic. But we had we had 2 very active newspapers here. The Times was really trying to make an incursion into Orange County, and so they had a whole office here. And Kathy Curtis, you'll remember, was the critic for the LA Times, but based here. And the Orange County Register had a really robust critical staff too. So you're suffering partly from what all of America is suffering from, which is that newspapers just don't have criticism the way they once did. I'm very proud of working for the San Francisco Chronicle because we have like 8 critics of different that address different aspects of culture. We've got a full-time classical music critic and full-time theater critic and book editor and theater, you know, so we're lucky or smart about how we do that in San Francisco. And I think that's being lost lots of places. So you just can't expect that the person who's based in LA can really get to see as much as they would have if they had an Orange County office.
Thank you. Let's go to Bolton now. Bolton Colburn joined Laguna Art Museum as senior curator, not as director, in 1987. And he became the director in 1997. So after 10 years here as in a curatorial position, and he was the director from 97 to 2011. Since then, he's been the director of the Surfing Heritage and Culture Center, and recently has been working with the remarkable California art collection at the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum at Utah State University. So Bolton, when you were a curator here, before becoming director, you worked with Charles. I won't ask you what that was like. And also with the director who succeeded him, which I'm sure some people in the room knew, to Naomi Vine, who's now deceased. Naomi Vine was director during the merger with the Newport Harbor Art Museum to form the Orange County Museum of Art, and through the anti-merger protests in Laguna Beach, and finally the divorce from Okma. So I know that it's putting you on the spot, Bolton, sorry, but could you reminisce maybe a little bit about Naomi Vine and the part she played in all those unfortunate events?
Well, listen, I'll try to do my best. It's sort of unfair that, to speak on behalf of Naomi, because she's obviously can't be with us, which is terrible. But before I do that, a little correction. I've actually been on staff here since '89, and Bill Otton hired me, although I never worked under Bill. So a little bit of interesting history. So, I think it was an interesting time going into the merger. And just to set the stage for everybody, this museum wasn't doing very well financially. Newport Harbor wasn't doing even worse. Susan had taken over for Charles for a year as an interim director. And the board was out busy looking for a director that I believe, and I don't know this as a fact, but I believe that would actually be willing to do this merger. And I think for anybody with some experience directing museums, the prospect of merging two institutions in a merger style kind of situation is iffy at best. And I know that the position was offered to one person and they turned it down because they knew that it was going to be a mess. Naomi had a particular background and a particular context which made the idea of doing a merger, doing something major like that with two institutions, which wasn't a common practice at the time, at least with cultural institutions. It certainly was with corporations, something that she was willing to do. And they hired her to do that. And I think it was a very difficult thing for her to do and to get behind and to help to orchestrate. Yeah. I think, both the board here and the board at Newport had very good financial reasons for wanting to do a merger like that, and that made a lot of sense. Unfortunately, I don't think Naomi had any idea of how a merger should be conducted, and I think the boards wanted to ramrod it through, and they did that, and it was a horrible mess. And she was, I can see her in the role of victim at times when the community here would lash out at her as representative of what was occurring, even though she was just the administrator carrying the duties out. She was, on the other hand, a really tough woman, and She was in here, stayed for the duration, did the merger as best she could, was able to, and carried it out. So.
And you took over as director in the aftermath of all that. What was the state of the museum at that time?
Well, it wasn't in a very good state. The collection had been moved out of the building and was out of the control of the museum. The building itself had suffered somewhat from neglect as you were thinking about going into a merger like this and whether or not they're actually going to stay here. And so there wasn't a lot of money put back into the infrastructure here. A new nonprofit was created to carry on Laguna Art Museum, and there was some assets in that nonprofit because they were very successful. The groups behind that helped create that nonprofit and that were protesting the merger were very successful at fundraising and had developed a little pot of money to help start up the institution and get it moving. So there were two full-time people, myself and Andrea Harris, and we were working with the rebel rousers and the people that helped get the merger back, like Ray, G-Ray here, G-Ray Kershew, and it was tough. The budget was small, $350,000, and it was one step at a time. A couple of people, Miriam Smith I can think of in particular, had some good ideas for doing an exhibition would help get some notoriety right away, and that was done. So we proceeded, and pretty much in a step-by-step basis. I have to say that the community was there in a way that they weren't there prior to the merger. So that was a good thing, especially when it came to raising funds and doing events to raise funds. I have to say that the most difficult thing was that the higher end donors to this institution were completely all over at OCMA. And there was no attrition. There was no attrition back to this institution whatsoever. They were moving forward with OCMA. They were totally bonded to OCMA and kind of considered Laguna Art Museum as an after fact.
Well, kudos to you for helping to see this institution through all that. And you had the 2008 recession to deal with as well on your watch. So, but I'll turn to something a little more cheerful now. You must have been glad to see the new millennium arrive, right, with the museum still standing, and you took it to those new heights quite rapidly with the fantastic gifts to the collection given by Mickey Gribben in 2001. That was great. And in the following year, the Surf Culture exhibition, which remains the best attended exhibition in the history of the museum. What had the mood of the museum? Yes, very good. Was the mood a bit more up at that point by the early 2000s?
Yeah, I absolutely. By the time Surf Culture showed up and was in position and open, the board and I think the membership was pretty optimistic about this place. I mean, you've never seen the kind of press that we got here. I mean, I remember walking through the show and there was German press going through. I mean, it's like that never happened. But on the other hand, it's not. How do I say this? Having me come on as a director was a really natural thing because I'd been here on staff. I'd been working on exhibitions. Susan and I had formed a really good team in doing that under Charles. Charles really, I think, helped push us in really good directions in terms of the quality of what we were doing and the underlying assumption that we should be doing something that nobody had done before, or we should be adding to the conversation on American art in a way that nobody had done before. And in back of that, we had this idea that we were really explicating California art history, and that's what our mission and function was. And in those terms, it was, at that point, it was like a candy store. I mean, we could do any kind of programming we wanted to. Nobody had, not any kind of programming we wanted to, but we could do some pretty wild programming, and nobody had even approached it yet. And that's not the case anymore. I mean, the world sort of caught up to where we were at. California art history is validated now at every institution, on the West Coast practically. It wasn't when we were doing it. It just wasn't. And that was really fun.
Yeah. Well, Bill, can I return to you now to ask you another question about the building? It's changed a lot since 1986. It's white now and not pink. And originally there was landscaping on the step-like elements on the exterior. I remember when you first opened it. That's gone. And also there was, this wasn't part of your expansion, but there was a hole through this floor, wasn't there? There was an opening, I don't know if some of you remember this. There was a big opening through here down to the lower level galleries underneath. So the building's, how are you feeling about the building now? You have to say something nice, of course, but
well,
I'm
I
curious.
told you that I made mistakes, right? And I had this vision when I first got here, that basement was a dungeon downstairs, and it needed to have light. And so I thought, if I can just convince the board that we'll open up the gallery and we'll allow the light from the ceiling to come down into the lower gallery, it'll really open up the space. Well, I was wrong. Because it didn't allow the light down like I thought it was. And to keep the character of this room, this gallery, like it was, instead of putting, my recommendation of putting a glass enclosure so you wouldn't necessarily look at the hole so much, they put this kind of early 20th century wrought iron around it, and it actually looked awful. And I could never say anything to the board or to anybody about it, but I thought, well, okay, I lived with that one. Now, the planting has to do with one of the city requirements, and that is that we were taking all the landscaping out around the building to expand the building. I said, okay, we're not going to take all of the eucalyptus trees. So I became the advocate for that eucalyptus tree that's at the corner of this property. I saved it because it was up to us to convince the city that we would be able to have a landscaped building with no dirt around us. And so the architect met with the city. The city said, you have to have landscaping in the front. He said, can we put the landscaping in the building? And they said, well, that's an interesting idea. And I'll be damned if they didn't support it. And so none of us were really, that was not an important part. But the expansion of the building, and you, in one of your comments to me earlier privately, was it's nooks and crannies in all sorts of different spots. Part of that had to do with the limits that we had on a 100 by 100 foot lot. And how are we going to get the Kuprian room to stay like it was, to add on here, on this side, to put, there was a request by some of the volunteers to put a kitchen in so we could do events here. In other words, all of this was very organic as it unfolded. It wasn't any great architect. I worked with a great architect, Ricardo Ligaretta, on another one of my projects, and it was a whole different experience. This one was so typical Laguna. It was so organic. It had the city involved. It had so many people involved in the conversation as to what the building was going to look like. And I thought one of the good things that they did, as contemporary as the building looks, is that they wanted something on the corner that was welcoming, that you could look through and see into the building and feel like you needed to go in and see what was going on. And I think that was one thing that they did do here. And the city was very interested in making the museum one of its anchor cultural organizations. I mean, we have other ones about art in this area, But they wanted the art museum to stick around and to if we could expand it, they would try to work with us to make it happen.
Thank you. Yeah, well, maybe this is for Charles, or maybe if either of the others would like to jump in. I wanted to ask a question about Laguna Beach as an art town, because it certainly was an art town in the days when these paintings in the room surrounding us were done. But what about the time since, say, 1972, when the Laguna Beach Art Association morphed into the museum? Do you think that it was indeed still an art town then, and indeed when you were the museum director, or is that a little bit of a fond fantasy on the part of our town?
Well, I'll answer that. I'm sure that we're all going to have a little different take on that. But it came out of an art colony. There's no question whether that wasn't part of the origins of this region, or of this particular area of Southern California. As it changed, and as these people that are represented in these galleries right now, as they got older, what happened to me as somebody who came in that was more interested, to be very honest with you, more interested in 20th century contemporary art, these people ended up hanging on to an aesthetic that is very valid in art history, and it's very valid. This is part of California history. What happened is that the artists that I was dealing with in the mid-1980s, when we did the addition to the building, I wanted to keep the locals involved, like the locals who had created the museum. And so that's why there's some local art in the museum, and I mean Los Angeles Basin art. And it was like, if we can just keep all that together, but yes, this has a history to me of being an art colony, art association, art community, and I think we owe it to our history to not forget that. Now, all the other stuff that we can talk about is the lineage of California art. This is part of it, but there's other parts that happened, and I just want to add one thing to it, because I know Suzanne Paulson is here. The way that we were able to change the art museum had to do with a greater understanding that occurred within the family in the art museum, and that is, you have to look at the modern stuff to get it. And we went back to the Cantor collection in New York and went with Iris, or what was it? What's Gerald and Iris, isn't it? Okay. Anyway, we went to New York. We went to 2 floors and saw the collection that ended up at Stanford. We went to Mo and the Hunk Anderson collection. Interestingly enough, it ended up also, a good portion of it, at the Stanford Museum. But it's getting out and seeing the art was so critical for us to grow up as a community and understand what we were talking about when we dealt with contemporary art. That didn't mean we weren't interested in the history. And that's where I also made a mistake, is that I think I gave the appearance that perhaps I wasn't interested in the lineage that had occurred in California art.
So to answer your question really directly, of course there were good artists in Laguna Beach. And Marlo Bartels is here right now, and in fact, he's been a really very active and smart artist, and you've got a permanent piece downstairs. But I think you have to recognize that it's a small town, and you're not going to have, I mean, you need a big city for a big art scene, and Laguna was a part of the Orange County art scene, which is a part of the Southern California art scene, and that makes it rather small in that, percentage-wise, certainly, and probably percentage-wise, there were more interesting young artists than there might be in many other parts of the region. But it's not going to be able to sustain a major art scene in a small city. There is, of course, the curse of the sort of tourist-oriented art that we know exists here, and that's something that the museum had a responsibility to try and sort out and make distinctions between. But we also, I do take a bit of a different point of view from what Bill was saying, in that it wasn't that there's history and then there was contemporary. Again, what we were really interested in the range, and so, for example, Susan did an exhibition called Pursuit of the Marvelous, where she looked at Stanley William Hayter and Charles Howard and Gordon Arnslow Ford, and how they helped to fill in that middle time. The whole sort of social landscape kind of photographs, photographs, listen to me. The artists who dealt with social issues in the 30s and 40s had not been paid attention to either by those who cared about the landscape works or the people that cared about the contemporary work. And so that was something that we really worked to try to fill in. Actually, in the collection, we acquired a really nice Peter Krasnow sculpture and a range of things that were trying to fill in that history. We went back and got an early Arneson work and an early Bruce Conner work and such, to try to bridge that gap between what's happening right now and what happened in Laguna Beach in the early 20th century,
Do you have anything on that, Bolton, as Laguna Beach as an art town?
Yeah, I was having a discussion with one of the prospective city council candidates last week about this. And to be candid, it's Laguna Beach is it's turned into a great town for consuming art. It's one of the best towns for consuming art on this coast. You've got the museum here, you've got the Playhouse, you've got certain aspects of the festivals in the canyon. There are a ton of other, you've got Laguna Dance. If you, and I know this has been spliced and diced a lot statistically, but, it's crazy. And it's a great place if you're a consumer of the arts and appreciator of the arts. If you're an artist, you couldn't afford to live here unless you bought something in the 60s or 70s and managed to hang on to it, and or you were, a very well-to-do artist. So there you have it.
Yeah. So it's part of the Laguna Beach Art Association's legacy to the museum is the tradition of having artists on the board of trustees and artists' involvement. It's great to have the names, of course, and it's a feel-good thing, but do you think beyond that there's a sort of importance and a value to having practicing artists involved in the running of a museum?
If they're smart about how museums operate, I think you can have really, really good business people and really, really bad business people on a museum board, and I think that's the same goes for artists too. But certainly, an active artist, and you mentioned that oftentimes you like to have somebody that's a prominent artist that really is engaged in the rest of the scene. That can be extremely helpful to the museum in terms of opening doors and also getting the rest of the board sensitized to issues that artists would care about.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the art museums are businesses, and that means that you're dealing with aesthetics, you're dealing with dealers, you're dealing with collectors, you're dealing with the artists. And if you can have an artist that understands how those nuances work and is close to the art scene that maybe a director might not be quite as close to, they can bring quite a bit to the board as advisor. advisory to the director, I think.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Well, let me ask you, whoever wants to take this question, about one of the big things that's happening in our region right now. The University of California, Irvine, is now the proud owner of both the collection of the large part of the collection of the Irvine Museum, plus the collection of Gerald Buck, one of the greatest collectors of California art ever. And UCI are working ambitiously towards establishing a museum and institute of California art on campus. They're actually opening just this Saturday. They're opening the first glimpse exhibition of the Buck collection on campus. So when this gleaming new museum and institute of California art opens on the UCI campus, when they've built the building and everything, how do you think that might affect Laguna Art Museum, which similarly specializes in California art, obviously, and what, if anything, should we do about it?
I don't think you can do anything about it.
Have you thought about a merger?
But, you know, those kinds of projects are huge. And the vision I've read is huge. And if all of you and your peers in this county can afford it, go for it. But the thing is, there is a lot of growing pains that are going to have to go, you're all going to have to live through before that happens, unless you can get the governor to build the big building for you and provide all the research people and all of the things that everybody's talking about. These visions are fantastic, but sometimes when you get down to the nuts and bolts and you start talking about the bottom line, I think it's going to be, just keep doing what you're doing here. You're doing a great job, and that will take care of itself.
Here, let me offer the contrary view, which is, you know, I think Laguna Art Museum should merge with that entity. There's no doubt about it. The board should become their fundraising entity. This should be their showcase. You know, even if they get the money to build the building, which I agree with Bill, I mean, you know, it's not the primary function of a UC to, you know, raise $200 million for a building and a study center. Even if they do that, they're still on campus there, and it's difficult to get there, and only people going there are going to be, you know, people driven there by their exhibitions or some research. So they're going to need a window. So, but I really see it being a way for this museum to move forward exponentially, and a big boon for them too, because they're going to need to be able to fundraise in a way that they've never been able to fundraise before.
First of all, let me.
Are you going to adjudicate between these 2 points of view?
First of all, I think that you all of us who care about the Laguna Art Museum and have been involved over the years, and those of you who are involved now, should accept this as a great compliment, because that would not exist were it not for what the Laguna Art Museum did in terms of raising awareness, in terms of exposing Gerald Buck. Gerald Buck was on this board for a long time. He learned an awful lot from his involvement here. He learned an awful lot from Susan and Bolton, and I hope from me. That's not to say that he didn't accomplish something really extraordinary. He did, but it would not exist without what happened here. The publications that happened here, the energy that happened here, the attentiveness to California's place in the history of art in America. It comes from here, and I think to a lesser extent, but to some degree too, Joan Irvine Smith's attention to California art also would not have happened were it not for Laguna Art Museum. Now, where that brings you, what that does for you going forward, I don't know. I mean, I can't agree with Bolton that this could be the showplace for the collection, because it's simply not big enough for what they're talking about trying to do. But I bet you are having conversations with them, and I hope you will have conversations with them about what kind of relationship they think you ought to have. I don't know that it's a merger necessarily, but I think that you ought to, and I'm sure you will, because you're a smart director, figure out how what you do relates to what they're doing.
Well, let me open it up now. Would anyone like to ask a question?
But I mean, even Malcolm has started to invite some of the faculty over here to lecture. It's a small step, but it's a good step. And I think that with Irvine, that you'll start to see them hire California specialists. Dissertations will be done on their collection and so on. And I think we could be a part of that, not just space terms, but in academic terms.
I want to know about how the satellite gallery started when you had it at South Coast Plaza.
Anton Sacristan, I think his first name was on our board. Henry Sacristan became very involved in this museum, and his son was on our board to kind of be the link back to the family. And Henry was also very involved in the Newport Harbor Art Museum and trying to come up with what could possibly, at some point, maybe have the Orange County Museum of Art over next to the Performing Arts Center. That was only conversation. That was not anything that was being acted on. But the next step that Henry took was we were getting ready to close down the museum for a couple of years, and we needed, if possible, we wanted to continue having some kind of program, and so he offered to give us a space over there, and that's how it got started. It was a challenge because the staff was down in Laguna Savings, I don't know what it's called now, but the round building downtown, and the museum was over in South Coast Plaza, and this place was under construction. I mean, it was hard to keep everybody excited about what was going on, but it really did work for a time.
Gene, hold on a minute.
With Bill and Charles here, I wonder if you could comment on the deassessing of the Outerbridge collection. My understanding is that he was a very famous New York photographer. Most of the photographs were taken in New York, but at the end of his life, he lived in Laguna Beach, and so there were some photos that were taken here in Laguna Beach. Why were they included in the sale?
Well, I wasn't part of it. I was part of the era in which the catalog, I was at the end of the process of putting the catalog together for the Outerbridge exhibition with Elaine Dine. And I never, the whole time I was at the museum, there was never, to my knowledge, a conversation about selling the Outerbridge collection to change the budget or add to the collection. It wasn't something that I was ever interested in. I don't know about what happened during your tenure, but I can't imagine you were that interested in getting rid of it either.
I certainly wasn't interested in getting rid of the collection. We did have conversations about refining the collection, and one of the things that we did talk with the collections committee about was the possibility that the Outerbridge collection could go as a whole, stay together, because the important thing to me about that collection was that it was a great research collection. And when it was sold off piece by piece, I think that was a great travesty to art history. Forget Laguna Art Museum. I mean, I'm sure a lot of money was made, and I hope it was well used. But the collection should have stayed together, and we did have some conversations with the Getty, for example, about keeping it together as an entire collection that would then free up resources for Laguna to be used to build the collection. But the money should only be used to build the collection. But that was something that was Charles being high-minded about how museums operate. We had some people on our board that simply saw dollar signs and just, I mean, they didn't make this decision while I was here, and they wouldn't have. I wouldn't allow them to, and it's one of the reasons why I had oftentimes conflict with some of the trustees here. And I think when I was gone, it just made it easy to just go ahead and do whatever they wanted to do, to be honest. Would you see it that way?
You know, I mean, we're kind of talking about rolling into the early stages of the merger, and Naomi Vine's, she's not here, so we can blame her. But I don't think that would be entirely fair. But you know, and yeah, I think, you know, when the board understood the dollar amounts that were involved, that really resonated with them on a business level. And I think it was a difficult train to stop in terms of deaccession and selling them. The piecemeal thing was too bad, but that was the last resort because they literally couldn't find, and you know this, we literally couldn't find another institution that would purchase it for a reasonable amount of money and as a whole. And the Getty, as Charles mentioned, was the best prospect, and they kind of turned their nose at it, which was too bad. It would have been a good thing for them and us as well.
Thanks, Brent. Reflecting on your time as directors, and I'm thinking three of you, and the roles and responsibilities that you had, what advice do you have for Malcolm, given today's environment and the complexities of being a museum director in these times?
I'm not a museum director anymore, and I haven't been one since 2007. I would say that looking back on what I was doing when I was a museum director, this was my first job. And when you're brand new, you've never taken a business class, you've never taken a museum studies class, you have been a university art professor who started a university gallery, and you come to a place like this that has so many opportunities. You came with the experience that I partially learned here the hard way. And so I really believe that in the market-driven society we're all living in right now, where art history is not as clear as it used to be, where you went from one movement, you know, pop art to minimal to whatever it is, ABEX, or however it evolved. Now, it's a little more difficult, but I think that what you're doing is reaching back and then pulling forward, taking a museum like this to reach back to its history, pull it forward, deal with the lost artists or the artists that haven't been given their due, and you've been doing that. I think this museum is doing exactly what it should be doing.
You stole my fire, because I think that's exactly what I would say too. You're lucky to have Malcolm, and I think you should really appreciate what you have. And I think that the way that he has taken this seriously as an artistic and a scholarly responsibility, as well as an administrative responsibility, is exactly what you need for a director. And if you had somebody that was only about the money side, only about raising money for the museum, it would fall apart. And if you had somebody that didn't attend to the physical needs and the fiscal needs of the institution, then it would fall apart too. And that's what I would propose, that's the kind of director that you need.
My turn. Well, no, I mean, I think, you know, the museum sort of solidified under your directorship here, and I see that, and in a really good way fiscally and in terms of the backing of the community, which is, you know, a really great necessary thing. I would say push it programmatically. And I think the other thing that people don't understand is how much pressure there is on a director at an institution like this. And I didn't really understand that until I stepped out of the role. And, you know, people saw me a couple weeks later and they said, "God, you look 20 years younger." Well, I mean, it's a joke, but it really isn't a joke when you're doing it, because you feel like you're carrying the museum and the community and all the issues on your back. And, you know, I would just implore the trustees to realize that and pay you well for that, because it's, you know, it's tough. And so anyway, here, Malcolm.
Let me ask Bolton. I'll speak up because I don't have a mic anymore. But oh yeah, okay. Bolton, you might have noticed that we haven't really been doing so much in the way of pop culture exhibitions in the last 5-6 years. And I wonder if, you know, this is something that I debate within myself all the time, whether we should be reaching into, I don't know, that someone proposed to us an exhibition about the history of the Hawaiian shirt. And I thought it was really fascinating. I think maybe we should have done it, but I couldn't bring myself to in the end. I don't know why. I'm too stuffy or something. But do you think we should be doing more of that kind of thing?
You know, I think a lot of it has to do with bringing together a talented staff and listening to their ideas. And, you know, a really talented staff will be coming up with stuff that hasn't been done before. That's the real contribution. It doesn't, you know, you could call it whatever you want to call it, as long as you're tapping something that hasn't been tapped before, and it's exciting, and it adds to the dialogue that you're involved in, and I think that's really important. But I had a tough call tonight because there was another opening I was supposed to be at, and the Peterson Museum tonight is opening a show called Auto Dictate, and it has to do with custom culture and juxtapose, and that's going to be a big splashy thing in Los Angeles. So I think this museum has laid a lot of eggs programmatically, and, you know, a lot of plants have grown out there from what we've done here. All I can say is just keep laying eggs. I mean, I like your land and nature, art and nature series. I think that's a really great thing. So go.
I'd like to make just one more comment on this, and that is, times have changed so much since the turn of the century. We are in the middle of a huge change in our culture when it comes to the arts. The millennials are a whole different group than the group I was cultivating when I was a museum director. And they're not interested in the same kinds of things that we were interested in at the end of the 20th century. As I see this, and I'm sitting on this board of a small museum up in Marin County, and it's like, we just had an opening at this little museum that had over 300 people show up because it was tied into the millennials. And the way it was tied into the millennials was it had music, and it had a food truck, and it had the t-shirts. It's like, what in the heck this isn't art anymore. This is turning into performance. And yet the art that's in the gallery is very serious, and the artist that made the art. So look at your audiences and just be aware that the audience is shifting in the 21st century. It is shifting fast.
Thank you. My question is for Malcolm. How do you look into the future for your vision to keep with the purity of art as inspiration versus all the market-driven and the business part of a museum?
Thank you.
I was hoping no one would ask me a question. Well, it is a balance. I do care about the number of people who come through the door, which ultimately leads to a museum thriving, and yet you can get a little bit too obsessed with the material success of big audiences, big box office receipts, and so on. I do believe in the museum as an educational institution, and not necessarily as a branch of the entertainment industry. And there is a difference between those two things. So I think it's our responsibility actually to do what we believe in as art lovers primarily, but then as museum professionals, and hope that it works. But obviously you make a few compromises along the way. I'm proud of the fact that we did, for example, a show of the work of Marcia Hafif. Marcia Hafif painted monochromatic paintings. It was just one color. It looked like an enlarged paint sample, really. And we did it, but she is an incredibly important artist who lived in Laguna Beach and has an international reputation. She's part of this whole movement within contemporary art that's a really fascinating thing, and she was a very vibrant member of that group. Now, it wasn't popular, of course, here, but I have no regrets about our doing it, because it was celebrating just one of the many contributions that Laguna Beach has made to the history of art, even if basically the people of Laguna Beach didn't really like it very much. I'm still glad we did it, because one day everyone will realize that this was a really important Laguna Beach artist, and I'm proud to be part of the process leading to that. Just as I'm proud that this museum was part of the process leading to the great John McLaughlin being regarded as a great artist. We did an exhibition of his work here in 1996, I think, because he was from this area, this great hard-edge abstract painter, and I dare say that wasn't exactly immensely popular, but now it's a feather in our cap, and John McLaughlin is recognized. There was a big exhibition of his work at the LA County Museum recently. He's been now embraced into the pantheon of great abstract painters. So I think that's the kind of position that Laguna Art Museum can occupy, modest though our resources are. And we shouldn't be deflected by that, from materialistic concerns. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Sorry, that was a very long answer. I got carried away.
I'd just like to say something that, under Charles, we sort of developed this idea that we were going to be one of the, we were going to be the people that developed California art history. And as part of that we would have to do the John McLaughlin show, which Charles actually started. But we also looked at this kind of expanse. And it's all about how broad you're willing to go, because you have the early historical people, you have the John McLaughlins, who are essential because that's new scholarship, and then you have the fact that California is a pop culture, it's the center of pop culture. So you can't ignore any one of those aspects if you're really going to be a center for California art. And that's how we looked at it. So we didn't want to turn our back on the McLaughlin. We didn't want to turn our back on Anna Hills. And we certainly didn't feel like we could do that also with the pop culture.
That's why we need an academic art.
Susan, I couldn't agree more. And I saw Janet Dominic before. Did she leave? No, she's here. We've mentioned a few people, and Susan and Bolton, and we're certainly proud of what we did. But Janet Dominic, Nancy Moray, Susan Landauer, we did assemble a damn good team of people around us, some of whom didn't really work full-time at the museum, but became devoted to that larger mission, or in fact brought their attention to that larger mission and helped us expand our idea of what it was all about. So I think that's important to recognize too.
You know, the other thing is, curatorial staff doesn't sit around and think of, gee, what's going to have a big audience that's going to come to the museum, and how do we tap that audience? It's just, I guess they could think that way, and maybe some curatorial people do think that way. We didn't think that way. We were thinking more of, okay, what's important that hasn't been done that we think is really interesting and should be done, and we should be thinking about for the next 5 years of our lives, and those are pretty important, profound thoughts that go into that stuff. And we used to look at matrices, a matrix for the exhibition area, for instance, and we'd take a look at, okay, it's got 3 or 4 points on it. One is, what's the attendance going to be like? What's the scholarship and the art acclaim going to be like? And what's the funding going to look like? So you had to get 2 out of 3 in order to proceed in that matrix. And that was a really good formula for us. And I think in the process, we discovered, and I think helped knit together communities that were here within the Laguna Beach area and in the coastal area in particular. And I think the pop culture shows did that in a way that I had never thought of, or you couldn't conceive of being able to do that. But there were large communities that were interested in those subjects, and we were able to address them. So I think a lot of it's just parsing what you're doing and seeing where the excitement is and what people are talking about and what people are thinking about and where the gaps are and where you think something might be going and jumping on it.
We just have one last question.
I'd like to focus on the immediate surroundings. The location of this museum is, it's a really good location. The city, the beach, the park, the cafe next door, and all that stuff. And there's an election coming up. I'm not suggesting you want to get involved in politics, but there's an election coming up, and there's the new guys that want to do new big things, and then there are people that are interested in charm and beauty, like the old days and so forth and so on. I think if this museum can cultivate, and I'm prejudiced about charm and beauty, the old days, like the painting over there, if there's some way to cultivate that might draw more people to this museum because they're coming here for the beautiful, charming town. Thank you.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. You've been very patient. I'm sorry. We'll have one more last question.
Thank you. I'm senior at UCI, and today we were supposed to come with other 3 students, but then they found out that there is a Beyonce's concert in San Diego tonight. So, and just representing them, and I just wanted to ask from all of us a question. For students, for millennials, and as you said, millennials view art completely, very, very differently. What advice would you give to students and millennials who are passionate about art and would want to work in art?
I don't know what you would say, guys, but I'd say keep the faith. I think there's going to be a great future for museums, and I could understand why people of your generation might worry about that, because everyone's so absorbed with other things now, like what's on their screen immediately in front of them. But as long as as long as people are fascinated by visual images, and I think the fascination with digital imagery on screens now is a sign that the visual image is alive and well. I'd be much more worried about words, actually. The other thing is that museums will always have the real thing. You know, that you can stand in front of any of these paintings and you have the excitement of being in just the spot where this great artist stood in front of his or her canvas. And there's a sort of magic to that you can't reproduce on a page in a book or on a digital image on a screen. So I think just stick with it. Stick with your faith in museums and don't be shaken by it. In my generation, we all thought the museum might die. And that was, I think, because, I don't know why, they were incredibly stuffy places, but museums now they've got their act together a little bit about engaging the audience. But I think those essential things that I just mentioned will always keep museums in business.
I would encourage young artists to, at a certain point, start looking at how the art that they see in a museum got there, to understand something about the history of the evolution of art. And as they do that, and as they continue looking at art, what they will start to see is they will start understanding a little bit how they fit in. And when they start breaking the rules and becoming the new movement or whatever it is they're going to be doing in their honesty, they will be grounded in having looked and having understood the past from which where they're working.
Do you have a bit of advice?
Well, I don't know if I have it.
Happy birthday, Laguna Art Museum, is what I have to say.
Well, the other thing is it's incumbent on museums to engage millennials, and they are to be engaged in a much different way than you or I ever were engaged, and that's really on digitally, and it's up to us to build those digital platforms and to make them deep and robust enough for millennials to be attracted to them and engage them on their grounds, on their turf, not our turf, their turf. So it's really important to understand where they're coming from, and it's a world of difference. I have two kids, they're in their early 20s. Man, they go about things so differently than anything I ever did. It's crazy.
What's your Twitter handle? I have one. Art Guy 1, follow me.
Well, thank you, Art Guys, and this has been a wonderful session. Thank you so much for taking part.
Thank you, Mel.